I am so honored to get to introduce this next poet who actually was a very significant part of my very first year fishing ever, which was not long ago, in 2015. But she is the mother to a badass, if I may say so. It's not a swear word, is it? Fisherwoman who was my first skipper ever. And then she came and was the most amazing camp mom ever at fish camp at Nushagak Point in Bristol Bay. And I was so in love with and inspired by her. And then I went to Anchorage after our season, and I was in Tidal Wave, the used bookstore, or the bookstore in Anchorage, and I immediately went to the fishing section because I was then hooked on fishing, and I saw a series of short stories called Entangled Nets, I believe, if not Entangling Nets, and I began flipping through. It was stories by all female fishermen, and lo and behold, Mary Jacobs, who's about to come up on stage next, was in there, and I felt like I felt like I knew a celebrity. I was like, it's her, I know her. So hopefully you guys get to enjoy just as much as I always do, Mary Jacobs. No pressure.
Okay. Boy, isn't this place awesome this year? And the sound is so good. So, in the 70s, my eventual ex-husband, John, and I fished king crab around Kodiak. Most of the people think deadliest catch when they think king crab fishing. Back then, it had about as much in common as the TV show as swimming the English Channel had with wading in a pond. Our little wooden boat, the Linda Joe, could fit crosswise on the deck of one of those Bering Sea crabbers. They packed 200 8x8 pots. We carried 15 5x. The deadliest catch crews are tough, husky men. Our crew consisted of a red-bearded hippie captain, his 4-year-old son Locke, a draft dodger, deckhand Jack, and a pregnant woman, me. But we were just like the deadliest catch. We took risks. On the boat at the dock, John and I tied pots to the rail while Locke climbed the stack like it was a jungle gym. John had rescued his infant son from his drug-using mother and asked me to help care for him. We'd been living on boats and fishing together ever since. At 4 months, my morning sickness had abated. Every morning, I palpated my belly for changes. It didn't seem possible that a fetus grew inside me. My body had grown accustomed to being pregnant, but not my mind. The baby didn't seem real or inevitable. I doubted my ability to carry a child. I even wondered if I had maternal instincts. You can't tell anyone yet, I told John. Why? He asked. Just in case. I couldn't speak my fear. I was afraid to curse the pregnancy. I went into the cabin and looked at our cramped quarters, the shit bucket in the galley, the 6-foot metal ladder to the bunks in the engine room. I listened to the screaming Jimmy and wanted to scream along. This is not a proper nest. I need a house to live in. If we have a good crab season, he said, we should be able to afford a rental. Just then our crewman Jack threw his sea bag aboard. Jack had a scruffy beard, baggy sweats, and a low Vietnam draft number. He stayed out of town and worked boats paying cash. As we pulled out of the harbor, John said, the fleet's going east. We'll go to the west side. It seemed risky for our first king crab season, but John had good fishing instincts. I was nervous about our hoped-for paycheck. It would be 5 months before midwinter tanner season. By then I would be near term and unable to fish. When we arrived in Uganik, there were no other boats. The bay was glassy calm. The surrounding mountains cast long shadows on the water, reflections of sun-pierced gold leaves, blazing fireweed, and snow-topped peaks kaleidoscoped across the water's surface. We set out our unbaited pots in shallow water, then steamed through the night back to town and picked up bait Another 15 pots and headed for Vicota. At noon in Vicota, when the season opened, we set 7 pots. An hour later, in fjord like Terror Bay, we baited and set 8 more. By mid-afternoon in Uganik, we scoped it out for other boats or gear. We saw no rigging, no wakes, 100 boats fished out of Kodiak. We hadn't seen a crab boat all day. We pulled our remaining pots from the shallows, baited and set them. I wondered if the more experienced crab fishermen avoided the west side bays because they were devoid of crab. There was no way to tell till we pulled our gear. That night, I dreamt of my hoped-for log cabin. In the morning, when the first pot appeared out of the depths, 15 red prickly crab were tangled inside, 10 were keepers. I laughed with relief. Jack sang. We tossed the creepy, sidestepping, eye-rolling, antenna-waving aliens onto the deck. Locke toddled out on deck in his yellow raincoat. He watched, fascinated, while I demonstrated how a king crab crushed a frozen herring with a claw that dwarfed his small hands. Don't touch them, I said. I gave him a stick to prod the crab while I shuffled males with 7-inch carapaces near an open hatch and pitched females and undersized overboard. Soon Locke was helping. He teased keepers with his stick until one latched on, then he dangled it in the water until the claw relaxed and the 8-pound crab disappeared into the tank. After pulling 15 pots and counting 160 keepers, we knew John had been right. The draft dodger high-fived the hippie. Pregnant me steered for Vicota while John played his guitar and Locke drummed along with a wooden spoon. We doubled our catch in our 2 other bays. That night we returned to anchor in Uganik. After 5 days, our boat was full. We were all smiles as we headed to Pleasant Harbor on Spruce Island to deliver to a small, locally owned processor. John drove from the bridge as we approached the dock. I sat erect and proud by his side. The cannery owner, Ole, greeted us from the dock. "We've got a load for you," John called up to him. Ole beamed. "We've been barely getting enough crab to process. Your load will keep us busy all day." Jack opened the hatch covers to expose a mountain of tangled king crab throbbing like a monstrous spider's nest. Locke and I watched from the bridge as the cannery crew pitched crab into the tote on our deck. Ole worked the crane controls and hoisted full totes onto the dock. John stood below the crane. "Fish and Game just announced that the east side will close tomorrow," Ole shouted down at John. "You might be getting some competition." I saw John cringe. I knew he dreaded news of our hotspot getting out. "There's not much crab left," he lied. "We'll be lucky to get another 1,000 pounds. I chuckled, but knew if other boats did show up, it might be true. By dark, we were done unloading. John climbed aboard and handed me a fish ticket and a check for $9,000. 10,000 pounds, he said. I hugged him. Our first load had paid for bait, fuel, groceries, and pot spot on credit. I envisioned the curtains I'd hang in my log cabin. Leaving Pleasant Harbor and crossing Marmot Bay, ocean swells buffeted the Linda Joe. "A nor'easter's coming. Our luck holds," John said. "It'll be hazardous for small crabbers to move from the Gulf." At Uganik at dawn, there were still no other boats, and the bay belonged to us. We continued to fish in isolation. The feared crab-seeking armada never appeared, and we continued to load our boat. It seemed like nothing could go wrong. 4 days later, we heard the announcement, crab fishing will close tomorrow at 6 p.m. Fishermen are required to tie crab pot doors open and store gear in shallow water prior to the closure. In the morning, we hustled through the Uganik pots. After pitching crab into our nearly full fish hold, we tied the doors open as Fish and Game decreed. In the afternoon, we pulled the 8 terror pots and stacked them. When we were done, John said, "We can't get to Vicota before the closure. We'll anchor in Terror and pick them up in the morning. We'll have to discard any crab we catch." "Darn," Jack said. "We could stuff another 20 crab in our hole. If we had one more full day, we could deck load this baby." I nodded, but was glad to have caught as much as we had. We slept deeply in an isolated lagoon, unaware that while we slept, the state troopers had been in Vicota. By the time we got to our remaining 7 pots, there were no boats in the uninhabited bay. There was not a ripple in the water. We seemed isolated from the world. Seagulls bobbed alongside our 7 lonely buoy clusters in the gray-green water. A down comforter of clouds blanketed us. From above, no airplanes flew. The only sounds were those of our diesel, the whine of our hydraulics, and the piercing squawks of our entourage of scavenger birds waiting for us to empty bait jars. We pulled the first pot and flung its door open. Several large crabs straddled inside. Jack disentangled an obvious keeper. He held the swimming in air crab and hesitated before throwing it overboard. He grimaced. Just then, John came out of the wheelhouse. He looked at us, our surroundings, and at the illegally caught crab. What the hell? Let's keep them. Who's going to know? Neither Jack nor I protested. Every decision John had made so far had turned out well, so we dumped the 4 illegal crab from that pot into our tank to intermix with more than 1,000 legal ones. Then we picked the remaining 6 pots. That morning, we topped off our load with 20 illegal crab. I pushed the last one into the water so we could close the hatch on our full load. We arrived at Olestock at 6. As we tied up the boat, he met us with a look of concern. The troopers have been here waiting for you all day. My heart pounded. My knees weakened. Ole continued, they just went to Kodiak for dinner. John huddled with Jack and I. Shit, he said, they must have marked the crabs in the Vicota pots. How'd they do that? I don't know, maybe painted them with ultraviolet or infrared paint? How can we tell? I asked, trying to exhale the panic gripping my chest. Oh, I've got it. We have to go to town where the troopers are to buy lights? I'll be right back. John climbed the ladder to the dock. I swallowed a Tums and nervously coiled an unused tie-up line. What a stupid gamble. Damn it, Jack said. Why did we keep those last few crabs? He buried his head in his arms. 10 minutes later, John returned, his eyes wide and unblinking. I wanted to ask what he knew, but he was already casting off the tie-up lines. Let's get out of here, he said. John leaped on the bridge. He gave the boat full throttle away from the dock. Smoke bellowed out of the stack. Jack and I climbed up on the bridge. What'd you find out? The big claws, John said. The troopers haven't been using lights. They've been inspecting the claws. We need to check the crab. What do we do? Look for labels, tags? I don't know. Let's hope we figure it out. My hands shook. I was feverish with worry. We ran back to the back of Marmot Bay where no one could see our lights and anchored. The overcast sky turned charcoal. John pumped out the tanks. Jack and I climbed in amongst the crab and started throwing them on deck. The fish hole emptied. The deck lights illuminated a mountain of crab. They played King of the Mountain in slow motion while blowing luminescent bubbles. I climbed out of the empty hold, pulled a crab from the pile, inspected its back, legs, and claws. There were no tags or labels. I threw them into the hold. We examined each crab, one by one. Then we found a marked one, etched with a jeweler's tool into the big herring crushing claw were the Linda Joe's fishing game numbers, the name of the inscribing officer, the date, the time, the place where the Alaska State Troopers had pulled our pots were also engraved deep into the shell. I held the evidence and trembled. What do? I asked John. Break off the claw. He said with the confidence of a skilled safecracker. I did and handed him the amputated claw. He dropped it into the ocean. I watched it disappear into the inky depths. I had a sinking feeling about the baby growing inside of me. What kind of role model would I be? I swallowed hard, shook my head, and deposited the crab into a bucket. I'll cook it later, I said, and we continued to inspect all 1,200 crab. We found 8 marked crabs. Just in case, John said, let's go through them again. All night we searched, but never found another one. In the morning, on the way back to Pleasant Harbor, Jack sat next to John in the wheelhouse. I sat behind them, pushing Hot Wheels back and forth with Locke. Why do you think only 8 of the 20 crabs were marked? Jack asked John. Oh, they probably only pulled 2 or 3 pots, John said. Are you sure we got them all? Jack asked. I sure hope so, John replied. If we haven't, it's not much the fine that will sting. Our load will be confiscated. Jesus, they'll take the load, Jack exclaimed. Losing that load of crab would leave us broke. Tears welled in my eyes as I thought of the upcoming baby and the promised house. John looked at Jack's furrowed brow and said, maybe you should stay in the forecastle while we deliver. They may be checking IDs. Geez, one more thing to worry about. How stupid was the decision to keep 20 crab that put all our futures at risk? And what were we thinking? And while harboring a fugitive. We saw the enforcement boat as we pulled up into Pleasant Harbor. 2 uniformed agents stood on the dock with Ollie. As we unloaded our crab, the officers went into the cannery. They inspected each crab as it traveled down the conveyor towards the cookers. They found no evidence, and without a word, got back in their boat and returned to Kodiak. I opened the forecastle hatch. All clear, I said. Jack came out of hiding. I breathed in relief, but the risk we had taken shook my conscience. I shared my misgivings with John. If you're not living on the edge, you're taking up too much room, he said. I was tired of straddling that edge. I wanted to crawl a safe and secure distance from it, but I didn't see how I could. It seemed that with John, we would be taking risks and ducking obstacles. I might have to wrestle the helm out of his hands. Thank you.